Okay, welcome. I'm just going to talk for this session just about the final part of our anatomy course, which is knowing about the different types of energy systems. So I've got about 14 slides that's going to sort of introduce the first bit of the topic for you and sort of discuss the concept of energy, and we're going to look at the first energy system. So there's 3 in total. The second group are possibly a little bit more complex, but I think the concepts within this one set up a nice foundation. So without further ado, I'm going to get it going. So the bit we're working on is this, which is the P7 down here. So it's particularly describing and explaining the energy systems and what their fuels are, how long they last, how they work, and it might sort of give you a bit of insight into how you might use those energy systems in your own sport, but also think about how you might train for them. So make sure that you optimize your training time to make sure that you get the best benefit out of it. So I'm just going to click over here. So today, part 1 is ATP and the ATP-PC system. So that might sound a little bit foreign, but hopefully over the next few slides it'll become a little bit more clear. So really by the end of it, I want you to have a good understanding of what energy is in our body, where it's used, and then our first way of reforming it. So let's consider this first question. So the first question is, what is energy and where is it used? So I think it's difficult to sort of think sort of conceptually about what energy is. So we sort of define our energy as a kind of energy currency. So if you think about the food you eat and think about what your sort of main nutrients are, you'll have, hopefully, that you have protein, provides a bit of energy, not much, or we don't use it until we're quite sort of fatigued. We use fat, so we're always using our fat stores. They're a real sort of important form of energy. And then carbohydrate, which is the main source of energy for exercise, really, generally. So carbohydrate is, in our body, we use glucose or glycogen, and we can take on board simple carbohydrates, like sort of very sweet tasting sugary foods, or complex carbohydrates, like much more things like bread, pasta, potatoes, that kind of thing. So ultimately our body can't use that carbohydrate directly. It has to convert it into a substance called ATP, which we call our body's energy currency. So we're going to have a look at that substance in a second. But I just wanted to first quickly go into sort of where it's used, because I think it's difficult to sort of imagine the concept of energy being used in our body. So if we take this picture first, what you can see is we've got this young man who's sort of flexing his bicep a little, and you can see what that picture is showing. It's almost sort of taking a slice out of that muscle and almost sort of presenting it to you. So if I just highlight a little section here, you can see the whole muscle there, and then we have what's called a fascicle, which is a group of muscle fibers, and then finally we have an individual muscle fiber. So just have a look at that. That's what we're looking at. So our energy is going to be used inside that muscle fiber, but it's at an even more microscopic level. So I'm going to switch over the page. So remember, we've got to this point. So we're looking at an individual muscle fiber that possibly there is sort of shown a bit too large. So let's switch pages. So the last bit I covered in was a muscle fiber, and what you see is in that muscle fiber, I'll just colour them in red, we've got these little kind of rods of protein. So I'm just colouring them in red there, And this is what's called a myofibril. So these are sort of individual little rods made up of protein. Now, what I'm going to do quickly, can you see, I'm just going to cover above in dark blue. Can you see how the corresponding bit underneath of that myofibril is just a little bit darker? So why it's darker is it's made of a protein, and I'm going to colour it in nice and thick here. Oh, my buggered that up. Called myosin. Now, do you see off myosin? You've got these. I'll draw a little arrow to it. Do you see there? We've got these little heads. Now, that is where energy gets transferred to. So what we can imagine, this is where my left and right goes wrong. So we can see those little dark bits act like little kind of rowing boats in a way. Just got to let the hound out. Oh, sausage. So the ones, as you look at it, on the, so it'll be your right hand side, are going to pull. So what we get is we get almost like two sets of rowing boats, kind of ratchet the thin actin filament towards the center. So what you'll get, I'm just going to draw it on here, is if you imagine the area that I'm just putting in dark is actually going to be drawn together closer, like so. So the little filaments ratchet like this. ATP provides the energy for them to move in this wave-like fashion. And what they do is they draw these thin red actin filaments closer together. So when we think about energy systems, really what we're looking at is anything that creates this substance called ATP. And ATP provides the energy inside muscle to literally move those tiny little protein filaments to allow them to initiate muscle contraction. So any other cell in the body where any element of movement or work is needing to be done, it will require ATP. So our three energy systems are really charged with creating a sort of abundant supply of this ATP. So I've got a couple of true and false questions here I want you to have a crack at. So I'm going to get you to just pause the presentation if you may. And I just want you to have a look at these 4 questions and just determine if you think they're true or false. So hopefully you've had a good look. So question number 1, our muscles can directly use glucose and protein to fuel contraction. Well, you should have thought, actually no, we can't sort of mainline glucose into our muscles and expect it to work. It has to convert it into the substance called ATP. So ATP is our body's energy currency. So when we take on fat, protein or carbohydrate, it has to convert it into ATP to allow it to do work. Number 2 says muscle cells are themselves made of rods of protein, and that's absolutely true. Yeah, we've got these rods of protein called actin and myosin, which has given away the answer to the 3rd question, which is myofibrils are made up of 2 types of protein, thin action filaments and thicker muscatin proteins. Well, you should have looked at that and gone back to the previous slide and thought, no, they're made of actin, which is the thin red filament in the previous slide, and myosin, which is a dark blue filament. So the last question sort of puts it together. It says the thicker protein filaments have swiveling heads that attach to the thin filaments when a nervous signal is received. So it's true, they do. So if you kind of see on this little picture on the right hand side, it's just showing a thick myosin filament with a swiveling head, and on the top you can see some ATP bound onto that thick filament. So that's what gives it the energy to swivel and do that work. So I'm going to just turn that over quickly. There's a nice video. I'll send this out with the full slides, but I do encourage you to watch it through because it gives a really nice sort of pictorial of that myosin head swiveling as it works. So I'll send that as part of this presentation. So I'll send a sort of a straight copy, as it were. But it's a nice one to sort of put it in context and show what it really looks like when those myosin heads swivel. So you can see where the energy is actually used. So as mentioned before, ATP is the body's energy currency, and it's important to kind of have a look at what it is. So if you see this picture, this is the one in your books, and I'll just underline it up here. This is the stuff. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So it's one adenosine molecule and three phosphates. And that molecule almost kind of packs in the energy. So what it does is it sort of holds this free energy and sort of screws it inside that molecule. So it moves around in the body, not giving it out. Now when we want it to give that energy to our muscle, the energy itself transfers onto that muscle. So it's a bit like something like a champagne cork. When you release it, it sort of transfers that sort of potential inside it into that sort of sound energy and the motion and the energy that's required to sort of kind of project that cork outwards. So we sort of talk about energy being transferred onto other things. Now, in this case, ATP transfers its energy onto those myosin heads. So the way it does it, if you see what's happening up on this right hand side, is the phosphate molecule is split off, and do you see what it's left in its wake? It's left that free energy, and it's that energy that then is allowed to be transferred deep into that muscle cell, onto those myosin heads. So when we talk about ATP as our body's energy currency, this is exactly what's being created. So carbohydrate, protein and fat, we can't mainline into our body. We feed them through one of our three energy systems and it creates ATP. ATP is then used to transfer energy into our muscle cells to allow them to do work. So the question here asks, what happens if I run out of ATP? So what you can see is when we use ATP, what we're left with is that, really, isn't it? We're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, i.e. two phosphates, and a spare phosphate. So we only have about 2 or 3 seconds worth of ATP, so kind of enough for a shot put, whatever this chap's doing. So our energy systems are really there to kind of resynthesize or recreate ATP. So in this picture what we've got is we've got ATP being resynthesized and literally taking a phosphate molecule and adding it back into that ADP, to reform that ATP. So we have 3 systems, and we're going to look at the first one now. They all work for different lengths of time, and they all use slightly different fuels. We break them down into 2 main categories: aerobic, which is our long-term energy systems, and we're going to look at the first anaerobic system. So we've got 2 anaerobic systems, and the first one we're going to look at right now. So we have 2 anaerobic systems. We have our ATP PC system, and we have our lactic acid system. So you've probably sort of heard of lactic acid, you've probably felt lactic acid when you've worked especially hard. So these anaerobic systems are kind of more of a short-term energy supply during a higher intensity of activity. So our first ATP PC system provides fuel for up to around 10 seconds. So imagine an all-out sprint, a maximal 60 meters, 100 meters, is really going to be, your body requires energy instantly. The fuel is a substance called phosphocreatine. So you may have heard of people taking creatine supplements, and a lot of it is really to enhance this energy pathway. So it's about giving energy to create this sort of short-term, high-intensity, explosive exercise. It's really simple. There's only one reaction. There's no waste products, and you just exhaust that system by running out of fuel. So we'll have a look at that system very quickly. So what we see here, so remember, this is all happening very deep in that muscle fiber. So what we've had in the first instance, I'll just do it in stages. So as I put that little cross, have a look at what's happening there. See if you can look at that picture and work out what's going on. So what you should see is that we started with a molecule of ATP. So ATP has been broken down and it's created ADP. But we've lost a phosphate molecule and released all this energy. So think about where that energy's gone. It's gone right into the muscle proteins, those myosin filaments, right deep in the cell to allow it to do work. So what are we left with? We're now left with this sort of spare ADP, aren't we? So you can sort of see this down there, can't you? So that ADP molecule is now floating around uselessly. So what we have is this substance called creatine phosphate, or you might know it as phosphocreatine. So it's made of a creatine molecule, I'm just colouring it in blue, and a phosphate molecule. So what happens up here, can you see I'm just colouring it in here, the creatine molecule and the phosphate molecule have split. So a bit like the ATP molecule, it creates a load of energy with it. So here, that energy is now being used to add. So if you follow the energy, I'm just going to follow it around in yellow. The energy is added to that phosphate, which then gets added to that ADP. So if I've got adenosine diphosphate and I add a phosphate molecule to it with some energy, what am I going to create? Well, you should see I'm going to create adenosine triphosphate. So the whole system is really, really simple. Simply the creatine phosphate, or phosphocreatine, donates a phosphate molecule to that free ADP, and it combines with some free energy and it just reforms it immediately. So it's a kind of seamless energy system. We don't really notice any difference in our power between when we go from 3 seconds to 5 seconds. You know, it's an incredibly sort of quick process, but we just don't have very much of it. So to summarize, what we see is that ATP is our body's energy currency. So I stress that because when we talk about energy, yes, we use carbohydrate, fats and protein, but to be used within the cells, we have to convert it to this substance called ATP. And that's why we have energy systems. So ATP gives our muscle cells energy by breaking off that phosphate molecule. So the phosphate disperses and it releases energy, which gets transferred into the cell to allow, in the case of muscle, those little myosin heads to swivel to draw those muscle fibers together. So to remake that ATP, we have 3 energy systems. So that picture that I've got on the top right hand side shows the sort of different lengths of time our different energy systems are used. So the one we've just quickly looked at, the ATP PC system, is used for around 10 seconds. So it sort of peaks at around, I don't know, probably 8-9 seconds up here. And then it starts to run out. So if we're going to continue sort of on a very high intensity, we need another system, which is going to be glycolysis, which we'll look at in the next presentation. And we never just switch off our oxidative system, which is our aerobic system. So it's the breakdown of carbohydrates, fats, proteins by aerobic means, i.e. combining with oxygen. So it's just incredibly efficient, but maybe a little bit slow. So we've just looked at this very simple ATP PC system, which gives energy for roughly 10 seconds, and it's associated with that sort of maximal intensity exercise. And it involves the creatine phosphate donating a phosphate and energy to ADP. So what I'd like you to do is just have a go at kind of writing out that equation. Just sort of show on a piece of paper how that would look. Just have a go at describing what that reaction is. So now, this is work you should be doing on Monday. Having watched this, I want you to fill out page 40 of your workbook. Now, just as a bit of a tip, so there's one table at the top which sort of asks for the energy system, so that should be ATP PC. A sporting example, you might think of a sport that lasts sort of up to 10 seconds, or you might think of an instance within a sport that requires that sort of quick burst of energy. It asks whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, and it asks for a system speed. So I would just explain whether it's very fast, medium or slow. Explain the energy store, so what is the fuel, begins with a P. The duration, how long do you think that system lasts for at maximal intensity? It asks intensity, so this is used mainly in high intensity exercise. And to recover Well, it's difficult to determine, really. I mean, if you've maximally sprinted for 10 seconds, it can take, a good few minutes or longer to restore those energy stores. You need your aerobic system to help, and you need conditions of no acidity in that muscle. So it's difficult. I'd possibly be tempted to sort of look at 2 to 3 minutes for recovery, but it could potentially be longer. And there's a box at the bottom which asks you to identify different energy systems for the following sports. It's a funny question, actually, because we very rarely use a sport without sort of using all of the energy systems at one point. So what I'd say is, maybe if you look at something like triathlon, you don't really use the ATP PC system. So you might sort of look at that and sort of not put a tick in the phosphocreatine system. But later on you might put maybe 3 ticks inside the aerobic system, and maybe none in the lactic acid system as well. Whereas if you look at the 800-meter run, I would probably say, again, no real ticks in the creatine box. You might put maybe 2 in the lactic acid system and maybe 2 in the aerobic system. They're both pretty powerfully used. So have a look at that, and I just want you to fill in the sprinting version, or the sprinting box, and then at the next lecture I'm going to get you to complete that whole box. I also want you to look at page 41, and I want you to explain the phosphocreatine system. So that's your job for Monday. Good luck.